On the morning of the 30th of August, 1776, British soldiers climbed the muddy defenses of Brooklyn Heights, expecting to find George Washington's army trapped, exhausted, and ready to be destroyed. Instead, they found empty trenches, dead campfires, abandoned supplies, and silence. Nearly 9,000 American soldiers had vanished during the night. No battle, no surrender, no last stand. Just an entire army stolen across the East River under the noses of the most powerful military on Earth. If the British had discovered the escape just a few hours earlier, the American Revolution might have ended before it truly began. Washington's army was cornered. The East River was at his back. British troops were closing in from the front. The Royal Navy controlled the harbor. And New York, the most important city in the colonies, was already slipping from his hands. So Washington made the only decision that could save the revolution. He would not fight. He would disappear. And somehow, in the middle of the night, through rain, darkness, bad tides, exhausted men, and a wall of fog, he would move an entire army across black water without the British realizing it was happening. This was not a victory. It was something rarer. To understand why this night mattered, you have to understand how close America was to collapse in the summer of 1776. The Declaration of Independence had just been signed. On paper, the colonies were now a country. But paper does not stop cannonballs. Paper does not feed soldiers. And paper does not defeat the British Empire. Washington's army was young, poorly trained, badly supplied, and held together by discipline, hope, and desperation. Many of his men were farmers, apprentices, fishermen, laborers, and teenage volunteers who had never stood against a professional army. Britain, on the other hand, had the most powerful navy in the world, one of the best-trained armies in Europe, and a global empire with the money to keep fighting long after the Americans ran out of food, powder, and patience. And the British had chosen New York as the place to end the rebellion. That choice made perfect sense. New York Harbor could hold a massive fleet. The Hudson River and East River turned the region into a military crossroads. If Britain controlled New York, it could threaten New England, control movement along the coast, and use the city as the imperial headquarters of the war. Washington understood this. He also understood something even more important. If New York fell, the revolution might survive. But if his army was destroyed there, the revolution was over. There would be no army left to retreat, no army left to strike back, no army left for France to support, and no army left to keep the idea of independence alive. So Washington moved to defend New York. And almost immediately, the British set a trap. In August 1776, British forces landed on Long Island with overwhelming strength. Redcoats, Hessians, artillery, cavalry, and warships all moved into position. Washington placed a large portion of his army on Brooklyn Heights, hoping to block the British advance and protect Manhattan across the East River. But the British commanders were not planning a simple frontal attack. They used deception. Part of the British army pressed the Americans from the front, keeping them focused on the obvious threat. But another column moved through a weakly guarded route at night, looping around the American flank. By the morning of August 27th, the trap had closed. The Battle of Long Island became the first major disaster of the war for Washington. American units were hit from multiple directions. Militia broke under pressure. Continental troops tried to hold the line, but confusion spread faster than orders could move. Men ran through smoke and mud. Officers shouted over cannon fire. Entire regiments were cut apart, surrounded, or forced back toward Brooklyn Heights. Washington watched the disaster unfold and knew exactly what it meant. His army had not simply lost ground, it had been driven into a corner. By the end of the battle, the Americans were packed behind the defenses of Brooklyn Heights. In front of them were British troops. Behind them was the East River. Across the water was Manhattan, and the only real chance of escape. The British had won the field, but they had not yet captured the army. That detail made all the difference. General William Howe, the British commander, chose not to launch an immediate assault on the American defenses. His decision was cautious, maybe even reasonable. The American position was fortified. A frontal attack could cost thousands of British lives. So Howe began preparing a siege. Trenches were dug, artillery moved forward. British soldiers tightened the ring. To most observers, this was the beginning of the end. Washington's army was trapped, the river was at its back, the Royal Navy was nearby. The British had numbers, guns, discipline, and time. But Washington had something Howe underestimated. He had boats, and he had men who knew how to use them. Among Washington's troops was Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, a unit made up largely of sailors, fishermen, and seamen from Massachusetts. These were not polished European soldiers. They were men who had spent their lives reading tides, handling ropes, moving boats in bad weather, and surviving on dangerous water. On land, they were ordinary soldiers. On a river, in the dark, under pressure, they were exactly what Washington needed. The plan was almost impossible. Washington would evacuate nearly his entire army from Brooklyn to Manhattan in one night. Not just officers, not just the wounded, the whole army. Infantry, artillery, horses, supplies, ammunition, wounded men, rear guards, entire regiments, all of it had to be moved across the East River before sunrise. And the British could not know. No drums, no loud orders, no campfires burning too brightly, no panic, no sign that the American lines were emptying. If the British discovered the movement, they could attack the rear guard, bombard the boats, or turn the evacuation into a massacre. Everything depended on silence. At first, even the weather seemed to turn against Washington. The wind was wrong. The tide was difficult. The crossing took longer than expected. Men waited in darkness, soaked by rain, shivering beside the riverbank, listening for British movement beyond the American lines. Boats pushed off into black water. Oars dipped quietly. Soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping muskets and trying not to speak. Some men had just survived the worst defeat of their lives. Others carried wounded friends down to the water. Officers moved in whispers. Lanterns were covered. The army that had tried to hold New York now had to vanish from it. Hour after hour, the boats moved back and forth. Brooklyn to Manhattan, Manhattan to Brooklyn. Again and again. Every trip was dangerous. Every delay brought sunrise closer, and sunrise could destroy them. This is the detail that makes the escape so extraordinary. Washington did not leave first. He stayed while regiments crossed. He stayed while supplies were loaded. He stayed while the rear guard waited behind the defenses, pretending the army was still there. He stayed while the night began to run out. By early morning, not all of the men were across. The sky was beginning to lighten. The British lines were still close, and if the fog lifted too soon, they would see what was happening. The American army would be caught halfway across the river, the worst possible position for any force in war. Not strong enough to fight, not fully able to escape. Then the weather changed. A thick fog rolled over Brooklyn and the East River. Not a light mist, a heavy wall of fog. On the American side, the escape continued. By the time the fog finally began to lift, the last American troops were gone. Washington crossed with the final elements of the rear guard. Behind him, Brooklyn Heights was empty. Ahead of him, Manhattan waited. And across the river, the British army was about to discover that the enemy they had trapped had slipped away. When British troops advanced on the American defenses, they found no army, no surrender, no battlefield glory, just abandoned earthworks, and the realization that Washington had escaped. Howe had won the Battle of Long Island, but he had failed to win the war. Washington did not need to defeat Britain in New York. He needed to keep his army alive, and he did. And that became the central logic of the entire American Revolution. Washington could lose cities, he could lose ground, he could lose battles. But as long as the Continental Army survived, the rebellion survived. The British were fighting a war of control. Washington was fighting a war of endurance. Those are not the same thing. Britain needed decisive victory. It needed to crush the army, break the rebellion, and prove that independence was impossible. Washington needed time. Time for British patience to weaken. Time for American resistance to harden. Time for foreign powers to notice that the rebellion refused to die. Time for one future victory to change everything. That future victory would not come in New York. It would come later. At Trenton, at Saratoga, at Yorktown. But none of those moments happen if Washington loses his army in Brooklyn. No crossing of the Delaware, no French alliance, no final siege, no United States. The night evacuation from Brooklyn was not a glorious battlefield triumph. There were no captured British flags, no enemy army surrendered. No newspapers could easily turn it into a heroic charge. But it may have been one of Washington's most important decisions of the war. Because sometimes strategy is not about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it is about refusing to be destroyed. That night, Washington did something the British did not expect from a defeated army. He did not panic. He did not surrender. He did not throw his men into a hopeless last stand. He preserved the only thing that truly mattered: the army. In the years that followed, Washington would be criticized for retreating too often, for avoiding decisive battles, for giving up cities rather than risking destruction. But that criticism misses the point. Washington understood something many commanders never learn. An army that survives can fight again. An army that dies heroically is still dead. The British looked at Brooklyn and saw a cornered enemy. Washington looked at the same map and saw a river, boats, fog, and a narrow path through disaster. He turned defeat into escape into survival, and survival into strategy. On the morning of the 30th of August, 1776, the British expected to finish the rebellion. Instead, they found empty trenches. George Washington had stolen his army across the river, and with it, he had stolen the revolution back from the edge of extinction. If this story pulled you in, subscribe for more cinematic breakdowns of the forgotten moments that changed history. And tell us in the comments, was Washington's escape from Brooklyn his most underrated move of the entire war?